All right, so hi everyone, happy Friday. Welcome to another discovery session with Efficiency Canada and Friends. I'm Natalie Irwin, Director of Stakeholder Engagement here at Efficiency Canada in Ottawa, the unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. Before we get started, a reminder to everyone that our guest speakers will present for approximately 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. So to ask a question, you can type in the Q&A box, which is found at the bottom of your screen. And for those brave enough, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your question yourself. We have a hard stop at 12:45 p.m. Eastern time so that everyone can finish their lunch, breakfast, dinner, midnight snack, depending where you are in the country or world. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Toronto-based architects and high-rise retrofit experts, Graeme Stewart and Yael Sepetano from ERA Architects Incorporated, who will share new learnings about deep energy retrofits, large multi-unit residential buildings. So welcome, Graeme and Yael.
Hello, thanks so much for having us. So as promised, we're here today to talk about deep high-rise retrofit. We're going to focus on a case study, the Ken Soble Tower, which is a recently complete Retrofit project, and also the context for this, which is really, with the image in front of us, the fact that Canada has an enormous amount of rental high-rise buildings from the 50s and 60s that are now really due for retrofit for a variety of reasons. One is age, one is state of repair, and another is new expectations around how our buildings should perform around energy efficiency, but also health and comfort, as we've seen from the recent pandemic and aging in place. We've looked at these buildings quite carefully and have collaborated probably with a lot of you on this call and with different levels of government to really make this a priority and to build from the legacy that's quite positive of having an enormous amount of rental housing integrated broadly into our communities coast to coast, and to build from that legacy rather than disposing of buildings to give them a new life. This is some watercolors from when these were brand new buildings in the 1960s, very aspirational, very exciting, and kind of a moment where Canada went from a city or a country of smaller homes to skyscrapers and larger buildings with a lot of aspiration behind them. And a lot of our work looks at what does that aspiration mean today in today's context. And a critical aspect is a lot of this housing provides the bulk of affordable rental and purpose-built rental across the country. This is some of the work we've done with CMHC and the University of Toronto and other partners to look at how high-rise housing stocks up coast to coast from different eras. And the navy blue blobs you see here is the housing in question, which is the largest of the stock, of which there are about 740,000 units across the country, home to many millions of Canadians. And this is some of the scary stuff. When we started this work about 10 years ago, there was this idea of we need to start mobilizing in concerted efforts of retrofit because we may lose some of this housing if we're not careful. And unfortunately, that's beginning to happen. There's been incidents where electrical fires, other building failures have required full buildings to be evacuated. This was an example in Toronto where over 1,000 people were suddenly found themselves homeless and had to find different friends and family, the shelter system, other places to house themselves. And it was quite an acute crisis until people moved back in. And that was just losing one tower. What if we lost 2? What if we lost 10? What if we lost more? So this is a top priority concern. The city of Toronto has identified the preservation of this housing as one of its top resilience objectives moving forward. And this is what we don't want to see happen. This is what's happened beginning in the 70s and 80s around the world, is the sort of destruction of this housing. What we found is that economically, socially, and environmentally, this just isn't the way to go. And thankfully, we're starting to see a concerted effort of campaigns of renewal across the country from different levels of government to maintain the resources we have and build build for this century. We've formed this group called the Tower No Partnership about 10 years ago, which is a loose collaboration of a lot of partners and maybe a lot of people on the call, where we've been able to, through a lot of engagement from a really, a broad tent, to be able to push policy objectives from a variety of perspectives. Also, a lot of learnings. I mean, this work is embedded in the fact that similar retrofits have happened around the world, and specifically across Europe, beginning really in the 1990s and at German reunification, and creates a lot of great lessons in terms of the regulatory and financial environments in which that can succeed. And Canada can cherry pick the best ideas and is starting to say, how do we actualize on this promise? And we have 3 core objectives. One is eco retrofits, one is social and economic life of these neighborhoods, and the other is neighborhood transformation, where new housing and new amenities could be provided. And working with a lot of community partners, really from sort of the ground up. Amazing work is happening in different locations across the country. It's really exciting to see. And when from the pure retrofit perspective, we really look at these 3 pillars. What is the financial environment in which deep retrofits can happen? There's a very capital intensive projects. What are the to what standard, and how do we look at standards of existing buildings? There's a lot of work happening there, but a lot of practitioners know that with Part 11 and other pieces, there's not a lot of clarity on how do we achieve best practice in a retrofit context. And then industry readiness. There's so much advancements happening all of the time and very rapidly. However, there's a long way to go in terms of optimizing industry readiness to scale this nationwide. And thankfully, some of the big movers have been the federal government and the National Housing Strategy, with a broad commitment to retrofit over 200,000 units of existing rental housing over the next 10 years. The climate, increasingly ambitious climate objectives and affordability objectives, which are really coming together with provincial partners to realize these projects on the ground. So we're going to focus on this project, which is just recently complete, and I will hand it over to Yael to take it from here.
Thanks, Graeme. Okay, so I'll run you through the case study that we're here to talk about today. This is the Ken Soble Tower renewal in Hamilton, Ontario. It's a 1967 building that has just recently, through our company and with a number of fantastic stakeholders, been retrofitted to the Retrofit Passive House standard. And as well as completely modernized. So I'll walk you through some of the learnings, considerations, and techniques that it took to get us there. Next slide, please. This building is owned by City Housing Hamilton, which is Hamilton's social housing provider. When complete, it will be seniors housing. And so it's really doing a lot of fantastic things socially. But it's really important to say, people always ask, well, what was the driver here? Well, City Housing Hamilton is actually a real visionary in this field and has actually committed to passive house and Retrofit type standards across a number of its developments through a lens that social housing should be leading the way. Next slide. And here you can see the tower in 1967, the year it was opened, and then midway through construction there, getting its second life. Next slide. So we had a number of objectives going into this building, and high performance was really just one of them. We also were tasked with meeting 20% accessibility targets. That means retrofitting existing suites to become barrier-free, which is not a simple challenge, as well as a number of community impacts and improvements to the social, kind of the social life of the building. And most importantly, a massive capital repair program taking a 30-year horizon on all replacement of distributions, finishes, systems, plumbing, you name it, giving this building a new life. Next slide. And a couple of visionary views from before the retrofit. Next slide. We often, though projects are often primarily driven by energy because that's where grants and utility savings and those kinds of things are, energy efficiency improvements are not always going to make a place a better place to live and can sometimes actually have unintended consequences. For example, not matching your ventilation to your new envelope, for example. So what we always do is we think about a comfort first approach where energy efficiency is actually a delightful byproduct. Are people healthy, comfortable, indoor air quality is good, etc. And if we lead with that, we find the results are often much more holistic and successful. Next slide. So just to talk a little bit about the scope of work here, but we won't go too deep into this. Apologies for the small slide. You can see that in the pre-retrofit conditions, there were a number of liabilities. A typically poor performing envelope, as most buildings built in the 60s were when gas was cheap. A lot of thermal bridging, as well as deteriorated systems, distributions, interior finishes, holes between units in terms of demising walls. Next slide. And so here it shows, in a typical unit, some of the improvements that were made. And I should say that this building had been emptied out of residents prior to the retrofit due to its state of disrepair, allowing us to do a lot of work in suites that would not be possible with residents in place. So you can see here, new kitchens, new washrooms, new distributions, as well as that new envelope. Next slide. And then in barrier-free suites, even more intervention. And as those of you who understand, trying to fit in those kinds of requirements in constrained floor plates means moving your plumbing risers and other kinds of things. So certainly not a small endeavor, but fantastic outcome for this aging population that will be housed here. Next slide. And just a little bit more about the barrier-free. So again, 20% of units. Next slide. So I'll focus in here for a few minutes just on the envelope upgrades. So Passive House, just as a quick primer for those who don't know, is an ultra low energy approach to buildings where it focuses on the envelope first. It says create a high performance envelope, so high performance that you actually can downsize all your mechanical systems significantly. And it has a very strict set of requirements, many of which focus on comfort before energy, which is very interesting, and it's a very holistic approach. So in this building, we were going for the retrofit standard, which is Retrofit, which is a sort of modified version of Passive House designed for existing buildings. So we knew from the Retrofit criteria that we needed a super airtight envelope and a very high performance thermal envelope, so R38 effective. But we also knew from our client that we needed a low carbon solution. That is, what is the embodied carbon of this retrofit? Of course, a non-combustible approach, but a rigorously non-combustible approach. And most challenging has had to be affordable. We know that high performance envelopes can be done with loads and loads of money. And there are all kinds of fantastic solutions out there, but it is challenging to do it in the context of affordable housing. What solutions were available? Next slide. So like many of these buildings, we came in with spalling brick, thermal bridging, poor conditions on the vapor barriers. So we knew that the envelope was not doing well. Next slide. And that kind of gives you a sense of what the building looked like prior to the retrofit. Next slide. So our initial approach was to sort of create a high performance envelope on the exterior only, so as to make minimal intervention on the interior. And you can see here a double wall assembly with mineral wool insulation, an EFIS exterior, and a fluid applied air barrier on the outside of the brick. Next slide. But like all good plans, things arise that you can't foresee. So here, this is us discovering pervasive black mold at the interior of the exterior face of the building. So there had been leaking, but it actually hadn't been coming through to the interior finishes to the point where we needed to remediate that mold. Next slide. And this fundamentally changed our approach, meaning we took a sandwich. We remediated the mold on the interior and brought 4 inches of insulation, again, mineral wool insulation to the interior, and then another 6 inches on the exterior with that EFIS system. And there's an interesting finding here, which is that while this is a higher intervention method, is actually two more familiar assemblies for the industry, meaning that there was some benefit here on pricing. Next slide. And that's the air barrier and mineral wool going up on the building. Next slide. And the interior, of course, the interior works very, very invasive. Next slide. And here you can see the sort of deep wall assembly created with the finished product. Next slide. This is too small to get into, but we did, and you can see from this detail that we did bring all the windows out to the exterior face of the building to bring them in plane with the new exterior insulation. And that also solved a number of problems around trying to get your rough openings properly sized for those windows. So just for us, it turned out to be a very efficient method of getting those windows installed. They're triple glazed fiberglass windows from a Canadian manufacturer, Cascadia in BC. Next slide. And this is us sort of rigorously testing every detail for thermal bridging, which is part of the Passive House criteria. And so every detail goes through this level of rigor with thermal modeling. Next slide. This slide really is speaking about, if you look at the top right, this is the window being installed. So you can see that air barrier and sort of the membranes going in. And we thought what was interesting here was that we used a membrane system that the trades could more easily install than what we often see with tapes and those kinds of things at windows. So this is a silicone transition strip, which really brings a level of ease to installation, allows for a sort of quality control approach. Next slide. More installation, next slide. And that's the finished product. Next slide. Great. I will speak briefly, and we're going to wrap up the case study portion soon, but I will speak very briefly about thermal bridging. So this building previously had balconies, and in its completed state now has Juliet's. And this was mostly an operational decision for a host of barrier-free and maintenance and safety reasons. But of course, on buildings of this type, if we are looking at scaling an approach like this, we really need to find ways to address balconies, which are tremendous thermal bridges, but pervasive in this type of building. So you can see here a set of studies we did with our partners at Solar, looking at wrapping, cutting off and replacing, and also enclosing those balconies. And we think there is a tremendous market opportunity around the balcony enclosures, which are commonplace, off the shelf, and inexpensive products in many parts of the EU where this is regularly done. And still, there are some fantastic suppliers on our market, but it's still a nascent industry, a lot of potential there. Next slide. And that's the Juliet's in their complete version. So you can see that there's still great airflow and ability to kind of, experience these fabulous views over the Hamilton Harbor. Next slide. I'll speak very briefly. This is just a nerdy detail of the Passive House approach, which is that you have to actually demonstrate that your building is airtight. And so we did a series of tests throughout to give ourselves a sense of comfort, because our final airtightness test came when the building was completely enclosed, meaning that had we found we weren't as airtight as we needed to be to meet our certification, we'd have to go back. With various standards across the country beginning to look at airtightness as a metric, this is an interesting thing to build into your specifications. So how do you build in sort of stepped airtightness? And here you can see we did both pre-construction testing to understand our pre-construction levels, as well as guarded testing on small areas, floor plates, or 2 or 3 units at a time through construction, so we could modify along the way. And then the final certification test, which was extremely airtight at 0.235 air changes per hour, which exceeded the 1 air change per hour maximum required by the standard. So it worked. And some of those tests underway. Next slide. And just a finished unit view. We did a lot of work on this building. You can see that we tore things apart. This is part of the work required to make those barrier-free unit partitions, as well as some of the direct ducting, and I'll get into that in a moment, that we did to modify the HVAC system. Next slide. Barrier-free washroom, fantastic. Next slide. I'll talk about just the HVAC approach, because of course, once you put this winter coat on the building, it's extremely high performance. You can really reduce your systems. We knew this building previously, like many of its vintage, delivered ventilation through a centralized system, bringing air into pressurized air into the corridors, and then just relying on that coming underneath the gaps underneath the suite doors to get into units. And we know from studies that that actually isn't very effective, and people aren't getting much fresh air. And really, people are relying on their leaky envelope for most of their ventilation. In buildings of this era. So what we did here is actually we kept that centralized system, but we brought direct ducting through the corridors directly into units, allowing that sort of hygienic, fresh air, more controlled volumes to come in. And we added here, and this is interesting, even though we reduced our thermal energy demand intensity by by 89%, we were able to add cooling, which this building did not have cooling before. We know every summer there's a risk of overheating in buildings of this vintage, especially in a seniors population who can be more vulnerable. So we were able to add cooling here, and then the heating system, I'll say just briefly, are air source heat pumps with the ERV. There's swig-on units, as well as some others. And so, this system is extremely low natural gas. And so as a result, we've reduced our GHG emissions by 94% in this building. Next slide. Worried a lot about overheating. That can be a challenge with passive house buildings. And so we did a lot of dynamic thermal comfort modeling. Next slide. We looked at 2050 temperatures to say, okay, are people going to be comfortable today, but will they also be comfortable in a changing climate? Can we really meet our cooling needs and our relative humidity needs, which the passive house standard, fantastic standard, but developed in a much less humid climate in Central Europe. So here we need to really take into account those humidity considerations. Next slide. A little bit about the cooling. There are a series of passive and active factors. So, blackout blinds at the windows, all your operable windows, ceiling fans, and then of course going on to the active cooling system. Next slide. And this is one really interesting slide, and then I will wrap up on the case study, which is we had Union Gas come in and do a third-party assessment of this building, and they actually produced this great passive survivability scale. What this shows you is that on a very cold day in the winter, if the heat were to be lost, in a code building, a typical design building, so that's in blue, you would actually reach temperatures that were too cold to house people within 4 hours. People would need to be evacuated. In this building, that temperature is not reached until 4 days, meaning that sheltering in place is really fantastic. It really brings, I think a new level of resilience to buildings that are treated in this manner. Next slide. Next slide. And okay, great, we think we met these goals, we tried to meet these goals, but did we actually meet them? University of Toronto, CNHC, and us as advisors are kind of doing a 2-year longitudinal study of the impacts here, not just the sort of measurement and verification of energy targets, but also some of the qualitative things we hoped to achieve. Did people feel more safe? How did the accessibility work out? What are some of the economic and social factors? And we look forward to hearing the results of that. On to Graeme.
Okay. So that was the deep dive on the case study. And during this, we were also able to work with our partners in CMHC to look at some specific studies around, well, how do we then take these learnings and advance and scale, for the next one and the one after that, and look at this industry wide. Ken Soble was a phenomenal project in that was able to prove that in the Canadian marketplace with Canadian supply chain and trades that we can do this project, and we're very excited. First of its kind in North America. But how do we go further? So we looked at 2 specific studies here. One is the generally advancing building retrofits from a supply chain perspective, all the more important now during the pandemic. And the other was looking specifically at how would we engage in such a deep retrofit with residents in place. So these are available from our website. We're happy to share it to get into detail. And it really is both of these coming together to how to push and accelerate the retrofit industry writ large. We looked at several case studies around the world with a lot of partners, one in BC with BC Housing, others in the UK, Germany, and France, were similar ambitious projects. And in the case of the European ones, other Interfit projects, but all of them with residents in place and looking at how that was achieved through means and methods. And this is some of the tours. There are a lot of learnings about roles and responsibilities and trade readiness. That was the UK example. This is one in Pforzheim, Germany. And what we found is, and if you look at the report, we developed this traffic light system, which is red, yellow, and green. The green were things that are readily available in our marketplace, and often what we use in Ken Soble. We use some of the yellows in Ken Soble as well, which were more difficult. You know, you had to import it. There were issues around trade readiness. Was there a novelty factor that was priced in? And red were things we just simply couldn't get, things that just weren't available, weren't warranted, and weren't CSA approved. And so what we're hoping, and even since we've written this report, that a lot of these reds have become yellows and a lot of these yellows have become greens. And how do we make sure that they're all greens? And that's working together as a broader industry to really identify and target those pieces. Examples would be plug and play kit. A lot of this is available off the shelf in Austria or the UK or other places where ERVs or other things are designed knowing that it's a retrofit context. They're downsized to the size of these very efficient units for these lower high performance buildings, and they can be installed in a very short period of time with one or two trades. Where we're still in an environment where often this requires many trades, many entries into rooms, and products are generally oversized for the level of performance that we're looking for. That's highly invasive for people living through that. We also look through from a codes and standards perspective, things that just aren't built yet into our codes, but really could be looked at least from a criteria perspective from funders or from municipalities looking at this work. And of course, in the COVID context, access to fresh air. A lot of envelope retrofits happen without a proper focus on to ventilation. So how do we build that in? What are some quick and effective systems? Really looking at the GHG loads, especially with fuel switching and other pieces. Often we're looking at energy intensity loads without considering the source of that energy and really and how clean that energy is. So really looking at a carbon focused as well as embedded carbon. We did a study looking at the embedded carbon in Ken Soble, and had we torn it down and replaced it with a like for like passive house new building, it would take between 180 and 200 years to pay back the carbon loss of that sort of dirty 1960s concrete frame. And so the city of Vancouver is starting to look for embedded carbon studies. That's extremely promising. That should be put into the metrics of all these projects moving forward. And there's a host of other things that we've written about, and you know, we'd love to answer questions. But one of the things we found to be really great from German building codes that made its way into the Interfit standard is minimum surface temperatures for indoor, including center of glass, that are very ambitious, which require higher performance envelopes and windows, which really lead to comfort. You don't get drafts, you don't get cold spells. And the other piece was looking concurrently with, we worked with Acorn, who is a national advocacy for residents, as well as a series of construction bodies and contractor bodies across the country, sort of as odd bedfellows to say, how can we develop systems that in that Venn diagram are good for residents and good for contractors? So we can actually say this will work in terms of delivering effective retrofits. And what it really comes down to is a sense of customer care, a sense of really looking, this is from a field guide we developed, and you know, please download it if you're interested. A customer care in terms of how can you design and schedule the projects such that you're entering suites as limited number as possible. We've been involved in some retrofits by contractors who will remain unnamed, where typical means and methods meant people were entering suites, you know, over 30 times to do a relatively modest project. How can that be reduced to 4 times? And how can that be fully transparent? And so we've developed, working with a set of partners, a sort of a series of strategies that we really, you know, want to move forward with as this scales up. So one is incorporating the tenant liaison role into the contractor requirements. This is becoming more standard in the UK, and BC Housing is looking at this in their projects. And what it means is that one of the jobs of the, say, an assistant site superintendent is to know all the residents, to know all of their needs, and to build a schedule around what's really happening on the ground. You're going into hundreds of people's homes. How do you build a schedule around that? And knowing that if you knock on someone's door and they don't open, that's going to cost the owner money if your trades are not used, but they came to site anyway. So that's one piece we looked at. Another one is specialized trades training programs to really sort of people can be certified trade ambassadors, both of low energy retrofits, but also in working with tenants in place. And this is broadly expanding. This is the example of the BCIT sort of center. A lot of you have probably been there and may know the individual in the photo, and does great hands-on training for passive house professionals to get certified. And the next generation of this could look at how is this done in the context of retrofit and residence in place, as well as Part 3 buildings. And then this is a bit of a scary slide. We were actually in London when the Grenfell tragedy happened, and we were unintentionally, it coincided with another a research trip, and we're able to meet with the fire marshal and meet with the council and really sort of understood the magnitude of that tragedy and how that's impacting UK building codes and will downstream or will impact our building codes. And this has really impacted the way that we specify products, specify insulation, ensure that these buildings that we're working on have fire suppression. Most of these buildings currently do not have fire suppression. How is that built into future standards? And we know there's a lot of work happening on the alterations to existing buildings report that's coming out. Different municipalities are developing retrofit standards. And I think with Natalie's picture here, that's my hook to wrap up. And I've only got 2 slides. One is there's quite a bit of work happening around optimizing the capital stack, really innovation, especially in the nonprofit sector, which is leading to dozens of these projects coming online. And the next round is to say, well, how are we as effective from the private sector side? In the last election, there was actually a really interesting primer by FCM about initiating a market rental housing preservation program, looking at a variety of pieces, including standards, tax incentives, et cetera. And that really is the big frontier and the next piece of work. I think I will skip this one, but I will end on this again to say that the goal is that we keep this housing for the next 100 years. And that in doing so, we can go a long way in meeting Canada's broader climate objectives. So thank you very much, and we'll take questions.
Awesome. That was just fantastic. You covered a lot of ground there for sure, and it was very inspiring presentation. And as you'll see from the comments the questions and comments that were coming in, that everyone adds little sections at the beginning of their question with impressive work or this is fantastic. So before we open the floor, just a reminder, we do record these sessions and post them on our website afterwards. We're usually able to get them up about midweek the following week. So you can find them under the education tab on our website. And also a reminder for those asking questions, we do have one rule, which is the same rule that we have for our presenters, and that is no sales pitches, please, which also includes statements disguised as questions. So without further ado, I'm going to open the floor to questions for Graeme and Yael. I know first question, since I have the floor, I'm going to ask my question. Is we actually have many different people who are attending in today's session here today. And I'm actually wondering what challenges you guys faced that you think could be turned into opportunities for Canadian businesses or entrepreneurs. For example, you mentioned you use passive house windows from a company in BC. So that could be one for like a company in Ontario, for an example. Are there others that if you said, like, if they're only a Canadian company that did X, like what would that X be?
It's a great question. I mean, it's sort of the magic question, right? And maybe one thing I'll say is that if we took on the Ken Soble project 5 years before, we would probably not have been able to either achieve it, or we would have had a lot of importation. And we've worked on other projects where you're importing windows, importing components, and it adds cost and risk. And also often GCs don't want to warranty things they're not familiar with. So we were very thrilled that we were able to, there actually wasn't a lot of friction in specification, which was excellent, but we designed it that way. There was a lot of intentional design to say what is available. And so if we were going to do it today, and so for construction 2 years from now, there would be already a lot of things that would be on the marketplace. So an example is We studied going for unitized ERVs. We opted for centralized for a variety of reasons, and including owner preference, but also we just couldn't find small enough ones. Every single one of them would have been oversized to service those units. Another example is around the envelope. Doing a 6-inch rock wool envelope was available, but no one had, the supplier had never thought to specify it for that reason. They'd never done a whole building. And now that they've done it, they're now sort of looking at it as an opportunity and sort of marketing it as such. So you can see the sort of innovation on the ground, which is really exciting.
Yael, do you want to add anything to that?
That's perfect.
Okay, perfect. So now I'm going to get to some questions here. So first one from Scott that was pretty popular by everyone was, how did you account for the air leakage through the elevator shafts, or were you only concerned for the units themselves?
Great question. So we knew we had a lot of liabilities in this building. The elevator shafts certainly, even not from an air leakage perspective, but from a thermal perspective, even our roof drains, the rain leaders coming down through the building were considered thermal bridges for the whole height of the building. So you can imagine that we had lots of liabilities that we could not, in an existing context, address. We were able to do some work around improving the envelope around the top of the elevator shaft, of course, but we knew that we had a certain amount of leakage within the building. And one thing that this project was not set out to do and could not do necessarily is actually reduce leakage between units, for example, or those kinds of things. So we were, because of the, so we built those in to our modeling and expectations, and we knew that there would be areas of air loss, and they were exactly where we expected, and so we were able overall to reach our targets. It is certainly the case that in a new build, we would have addressed those issues and designed them differently. And one interesting side note is that in Germany, where the passive house standard comes from, garbage chutes are not done. They're not permitted. They're considered to be unsafe. And so, there are a lot of also cultural factors where things like that are required. How then do you address leakage and thermal losses through those shafts? So definitely a different context.
I would say definitely, and you're planned well, I would say, for everything to work out in your favor. So well done for your great planning, for sure. A question here from Chris is, thanks again for the great presentation and case study. Your Ken Soble example is publicly owned building. Do you have any tips for how to accelerate apartment retrofits in privately owned buildings? So traditional paybacks and business modelings make it hard for them to look attractive.
I'll take a crack at that. So it's a loaded question. So there's we could have a whole seminar. But what I would say is that in the private sector, and we, through working with the City of Toronto and others, and we've worked on with private sector partners to do retrofits. But there's an absolute ceiling about the business case. There really is. At a certain point, there's only so much investment that you can do where it makes sense, and it isn't yet at the level that we were able to achieve at Ken Soble. And part of that is because prior to the National Housing Strategy and some other provincial supported programs, which were about housing preservation and climate resilience, the nonprofit industry didn't have anything. The buildings were really just starting to crumble. And so there's been an amazing public sector or policy objective to really focus there. And we really look at that as the first market. The current set of policies and available funding are really targeted at the most vulnerable and the most and ensuring that housing is preserved and that it's able to then meet these 21st century objectives. But that's creating an amazing amount of learning for industry readiness. And the broader goal is, how do we make things better, faster, and cheaper, and create a broad market where this can happen? And so what we're seeing is in the private sector, the ambition level is ticking up as things are becoming more known and more certain. And there's so some of this innovation is spreading. However, there's still a long way to go until this really until this really scales. And that'll take a lot of policy partnerships, and are there tax incentives that spur this work? I'm sure the owners of buildings don't want to hear this, but like in New York State, the recent local law 97, are there actually carbon budgets for buildings that people then need to be lower than their carbon budgets, and they have 10 years to meet that target or whatever. So I think it's a host of financial and regulatory contexts that'll really move and scale the market writ large. But at this point, the fact that there's a real targeted effort to take our public and nonprofit housing and bring it to this level, and we're starting to see that happen, is very exciting.
Definitely, and I will say, stick around for the next 5 minutes, and I'll share some news on that note as well. So Arif has a great question here. I love the comfort first and energy efficiency as a byproduct concept. Do you think the energy efficiency industry can be more effective by taking this concept on over the current one, where we only care about fund energy upgrades?
Such an important question, and really, really foundational to how we're approaching our existing building stock. In the light of COVID, we've seen that there are many other considerations that are public policy priorities that are not carbon, while carbon is still very well understood. We're seeing, okay, well, will there be money for ventilation upgrades in schools and workplaces and those kinds of things? So yes, there are a whole host of other needs that need to be taken into account. And that's why, we really don't like the menu approach of retrofits. Well, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. We really think it must always be considered holistically. What other aspects of the building system are you going to affect if you start to even replace your windows or add new sealants or whatever it's going to be? What are the impacts on the other parts of the building? And we can see there are some perverse disincentives to working holistically. For example, rightly, as the person asking the question says, a lot of our available funding is tied to carbon. But in a building that basically has very little effective ventilation, the addition of proper modernized ventilation is an addition of energy use, right? So it could be seen to be working at cross purposes, but of course we have to look at it holistically. And that's where standards come into place. So it makes sense that our current programs are tied to very concrete carbon targets. That makes sense. But that's where we need codes, and if not codes, then guidelines to give guidance to practitioners and owners about what is safe to do. It may not be safe to do a high performance envelope without addressing ventilation. You may get mold, condensation, poor indoor air quality, and associated health risks. So right now our codes are silent on these issues, and it relies on the experience, expertise, and sort of goodwill of the practitioner and owner making those decisions. That needs to go further.
Definitely. And I would say I've always found the best salespeople for energy efficiency products are the ones that say, here are all the benefits of energy efficiency. Oh, and by the way, it's also going to save you money. So that's kind of like that seals the deal. No pun intended with an energy efficiency there with air sealing. One last question. There's some great ones there. So if you want to contact the presenters, email us and I'm happy to make the connection. Andy says you guys are awesome, obviously. Was there any need for shading strategies on the sunny exposure of buildings?
Maybe I'll tackle that one. I guess what was really interesting and indicative of why this generation of buildings is great for retrofit. I mean, it's required. We want to keep this housing stock. We have to keep this housing stock going. But because it was designed with relatively small window to wall ratios, already it performed very well. We had an 18% window to wall ratio. So there wasn't a lot we needed to do. It was actually lower than you'd even set up initially. But what you can see from the photographs, there were still very generous windows, very generous views. So it worked out quite well in that case. One of the things I think exterior shades is something that you could really say is an example of a supply chain challenge. If any of you have been to Middle Europe and seen passive house buildings or even non-passive house buildings, almost all of them have those exterior blinds that kind of lock down in the summer. And then people have the cultural attitude when they leave their unit, you press a switch, it closes up, and then when you come in, it's cool. It makes total sense. We looked at specifying those, and I talked to other practitioners who tried ahead of us and found out it was just a no-go. It was like people who've tried them, there's no local manufacturers, it's all imported. Trades don't want to install them. People will not warranty them. And by the time you bring them over, and projects that have done it, it's an absolute luxury product. You've spent hand over fist to bring in this thing that in Europe is literally the equivalent of a Home Depot thing that you just like put on your thing. It is considered the most standard product in Europe. And for us to emulate it, it's an absolute premium and a headache on site. So we opted to say, you know what, let's not do that. Let's just do what makes sense in our context. So we've modeled everything, as Yael said, to say we need to meet our standards. So does that mean thicker insulation? Does it mean, we're doing more, what are the coatings on the window? We did interior blackout blinds, which are, dirt cheap and do the job. And so by looking at the overall performance of different parts of the systems, we were able to compensate. But it does really speak to the idea of, is the solution to create a Canadian supply chain so we can match Europe in price and availability of exterior blinds, or do we just do a design solution that actually works with our trade knowledge? And I don't know which one's the right answer, but what we found is emulating what is actually cheap in Europe can be very cumbersome and expensive in our context.
Very interesting. Kind of comes full circle to the first question asked, for sure. So there you go, entrepreneurs. There's a problem that you can figure out. I'm going to end there. I know there's a lot of questions left, but I always say there's a hard stop at 12:45, and people do enjoy that. So thank you again. Fantastic presentation. The recording is going to go up on our website. Next week, I'm actually thrilled to share that we will continue our retrofit theme with the release of a new report by Efficiency Canada on the retrofit mission. So keep an eye on your inboxes next week, and the report will come out. And next Friday, the report authors, who are Brendan Haley and who's our policy director, and Ralph Torrey, will join me to share highlights on the report, including why traditional policy tools and current market structures hold back achieving economies of scale and answer your burning questions. So I hope you can join me for that one as well. Thank you again, Yael and Graeme, for joining us today. Have a great evening, great weekend, everyone. Great afternoon, and take care. Bye.